a huge amount of unrecorded human history beneath the ocean surface that we don't know very much about at all. People want to believe in places like Atlantis. They want to believe in other worlds.
What if Atlantis wasn't a myth, and we had real proof 5 times, only to see it vanish forever?
There are shapes on the seabed that just don't make sense.
From a statue pointing west that mysteriously disappeared from a royal vault, to 86 glowing bars pulled from a sunken Sicilian shipwreck, to a 6,000-ton explosion that may have destroyed the last ruins of a sunken German city. This isn't fiction. It's documented, buried, and lost, again and again. Ready to see what shouldn't have been lost? Let's start with the moment when a single explosion may have erased the most physical evidence of Atlantis we ever had. The Big Bang. You ever notice how some historical cleanups feel a little too thorough? In 1947, 6,000 tons of explosives were detonated inside the core of a small island. When the smoke cleared, British engineers hadn't just destroyed leftover Nazi fortifications. They may have wiped out the only underwater ruins that could have supported a wild claim that Atlantis wasn't Greek at all, but German, and that it sank in the North Sea 3,000 years ago. The island was Helgoland. Its name translates to Holy Land. And to Heinrich Himmler, that wasn't poetic. It was literal. As head of the SS and architect of the Ahnenerbe, the research unit obsessed with proving ancient German superiority, Himmler fixated on this red sandstone outcrop 28 miles off the German coast. He believed Helgoland wasn't just strategic ground. He believed it was a surviving fragment of Atlantis itself. Orders went out. Investigations began. Divers were sent to the Steingrund, an underwater reef just offshore. What they reported sounded wrong. Flat stone surfaces stretched across the seabed. Wall-like formations rose from the sand. Enclosed spaces appeared deliberate, built. These weren't vague impressions. Spanuth's divers photographed what they found. The images were crude by modern standards, but clear enough to show geometry, repeating patterns where nature doesn't usually bother. In the 1950s, German marine archaeologist Walther Kuhn examined the photos. He noted regular spacing, parallel alignments, structures uncommon in natural basalt. Still, he hesitated. The massive blast in 1947, he warned, had destroyed too much. Any firm archaeological conclusion was now out of reach. That only strengthened Himmler's belief. He became convinced Helgoland had once been 5 or 6 times larger, with a submerged city still intact offshore, waiting to validate his ideas about Aryan origins. The war ended before he could prove it. The theory didn't end with him. Jürgen Spanuth picked it up and ran. A German pastor, archaeologist, and former Nazi party member, Spanuth expanded the case. He argued Helgoland was part of Basileia, the royal capital Plato described. The Atlanteans, he claimed, were the sea peoples recorded by the Egyptians around 1200 BCE, warriors shown with round shields and horned helmets. To fix Plato's impossible timeline of 9,000 years, Spanuth proposed it referred to lunar months, not solar years, placing the disaster around 1230 BCE. He even suggested a comet strike in the North Sea. Spanuth didn't just theorize, he dove. What came back seemed to line up too neatly. Stone walls, paved seabeds, anchor stones, building materials in white, red, and black, matching Plato's description exactly. The massive amber deposits washing ashore nearby, he claimed, were orichalcum, the legendary metal said to coat Atlantean temples. Even local mythology fit when he linked the god Phocite to Poseidon, arguing a lost temple once stood on Helgoland's drowned edges. Northern bronze swords, horned helmets on Egyptian reliefs, amber-rich ruins beneath the waves. To Spanuth, it wasn't coincidence. It was memory. Then came April 18, 1947. British engineers packed Helgoland's submarine bunkers with explosives, 90,000 shells, 4,000 torpedo warheads, 9,000 depth charges. At exactly 1 o'clock, everything detonated at once. The blast tore a crater into the island's core, erased the southern half, and flung debris miles into the sea. Officially, it was symbolic. the final destruction of Nazi militarism. But if Spanuth was right, if any physical proof lay beneath Helgoland or the Steingrund Reef, it was shattered beyond recovery that afternoon. Whether by accident or design, the strongest evidence linking Atlantis to the North Sea may have vanished in a cloud of salt and pulverized stone, leaving only pre-war reports later dismissed as propaganda. Seismographs across northern Europe recorded the blast. Pilots saw the crater from 10,000 feet. British records admit the explosion was intentionally oversized, far beyond what was needed to destroy the bunkers alone. The seabed within half a mile was churned meters deep, erasing whatever context had survived. Stone turned to dust, history with it. And somewhere across the Atlantic, another piece of the puzzle had already disappeared centuries earlier, under circumstances just as uncomfortable. The statue that pointed west, Corvo's lost guardian. A stone horseman stood on a volcanic cliff in the middle of the Atlantic for centuries with one finger pointing west towards something beyond the horizon. And when Portuguese sailors finally tried to move it, it broke into pieces that disappeared from a royal treasury, as if someone didn't want anyone following that direction. Portuguese explorers officially documented Corvo around 1452, making it one of the last Azores Islands to be recorded, and discovered something that defied explanation. High on a sheer cliff overlooking the open ocean stood a massive statue carved from a single block of stone, depicting a cloaked rider on a bareback horse. The rider wore what witnesses described as a flowing Moorish-style cape, gripped the horse's mane with one hand, and extended the other hand outward with the index finger pointing directly west into the empty Atlantic. At the statue's base were deeply carved letters, ancient symbols already worn smooth by salt and time. Sailors had to tie ropes around their waists and rappel down the cliff face just to examine the inscription, but none of them could decipher the weathered characters. News of the discovery reached King Manuel I of Portugal, who immediately ordered the statue transported to Lisbon for study. During the attempt to remove it from the cliff, the statue broke apart. The head, one arm, a foot, and the horse's head were reportedly stored in the royal treasury, where they sat on display for a brief period before disappearing completely. The Portuguese royal treasury maintained meticulous inventory records, yet no catalog entry for these statue fragments exists after their initial receipt. The Great Lisbon earthquake of 1755 destroyed much of the royal archive and treasury holdings. Historians assume the fragments were either lost in that catastrophe or removed earlier under circumstances that went unrecorded. By 1800, no Portuguese scholar could locate the pieces or any technical drawings. Even the official drawing commissioned to document the statue vanished from the archives. But several writers wrote about what they saw. The most credible will come from the chronicler Damião de Guas, who recorded eyewitness descriptions of the statue and its discovery in 1567. 2 centuries later, a violent storm battered Corvo's coastline and exposed the ruins of a stone building that had been buried beneath the beach. Inside a cracked black vessel, workers discovered a cache of coins, Carthaginian gold, and North African copper, proving that Mediterranean sailors had somehow crossed the Pillars of Hercules and reached these islands 800 miles into the Atlantic, centuries before the Portuguese exploration. The Carthaginian coins included pieces dated to approximately 300 BCE, the period when Carthage was locked in the Punic Wars with Rome. If Carthaginians reached the Azores, they crossed 900 miles of open ocean using navigation technology that historians insist didn't exist yet, which means either our timeline is fundamentally wrong or someone taught them routes that shouldn't have been known. Ancient sources suggest they had reason to make that journey. The writer Diodorus Siculus recorded that Carthaginians knew of a large fertile island far to the west and deliberately kept its location secret as a refuge if their empire ever fell. Was the statue pointing toward that hidden land? Toward the Americas, which weren't supposed to be discovered for another 1,000 years? Or toward something older, closer, and more dangerous to acknowledge? The Azores sit directly on the mid-Atlantic ridge, rising from underwater plateaus that suggest a much larger landmass once existed in the region before volcanic activity and rising seas reshaped the geography. Renaissance cartographers sometimes labeled these islands the Islands of the Blessed, echoing ancient Greek legends of a paradise that sank beneath the waves. The location matches Plato's description of Atlantis lying beyond the Pillars of Hercules in the Atlantic Ocean. Other mysteries scattered across the archipelago deepen the questions. Stepped pyramid-like structures on Pico aligned with the summer solstice, a cave on São Miguel containing an ancient scroll with Hebrew letters, and in 2013, sonar detecting what appeared to be a submerged pyramid between São Miguel and Terceira, with its peak just 40 feet below the surface. So who carved the horseman, and what lay in the direction he pointed? Was he a Carthaginian scout marking a route, a Phoenician explorer memorializing a discovery, or something older, an Atlantean sentinel positioned at the edge of a drowned empire to guide survivors or warn away intruders? We'll never know because someone made sure the statue couldn't point anymore. While that stone sentinel crumbled in royal hands, the written story of Atlantis itself was suffering an even more devastating fate. Plato's missing pages. You don't lose the ending of the most important lost civilization story in human history by accident. Yet the oldest account of Atlantis stops mid-sentence, right as Zeus is about to pronounce judgment. Exactly where the text should explain how Atlantis was destroyed. Exactly where it should say whether anyone survived. The ending didn't vanish because it was never written. It vanished because the pages that mattered most went missing. The story of Atlantis appears in two dialogues by Plato, Timaeus and Critias. Together they describe a powerful maritime empire that attempted to dominate the Mediterranean world before being wiped out in a single day and night of catastrophic destruction. Timaeus introduces the tale briefly. Critias slows everything down and fills in extraordinary detail. Concentric rings of land and water, advanced canal engineering, immense mineral wealth, sophisticated metallurgy, and a society that begins noble but gradually decays into corruption, arrogance, and aggression. The narrative builds tension deliberately. Zeus watches the Atlanteans abandon restraint and justice. Their moral collapse reaches a breaking point. Zeus decides punishment is necessary. He summons the gods to pass judgment. And then the text ends. And when he had called them together, he spake as follows. Nothing follows. No sentence, no verdict, no destruction, no explanation of what happened next. For centuries, scholars claimed Plato simply never finished Critias. It's a convenient answer. It doesn't survive scrutiny. Plato lived at least another decade after writing it and went on to complete the Laws, a massive 12-book philosophical work. He clearly had the time, energy, and discipline to finish the Atlantis account if he wanted to. More importantly, Critias survives on papyrus. Papyrus was expensive and typically reserved for finalized texts, not incomplete drafts written on reusable wax tablets. That strongly suggests a complete version once existed and was later damaged or lost. In antiquity, no one described Critias as unfinished, not for centuries. The first complaint about a missing ending comes from Plutarch nearly 500 years after Plato's death. Before that, silence. Earlier writers closer to Plato's lifetime, including Aristotle in the 4th century BCE, referenced Atlantis without noting any abrupt cutoff. That implies more complete versions may have circulated shortly after Plato died. Ancient manuscripts were fragile. Papyrus degraded in humidity, leather bindings rotted, parchment tore through repeated handling. A damaged final section could easily be lost during copying, especially if scribes encountered text too deteriorated to read and simply stopped where legibility ended. The loss matters because Plato promised specifics. Critias repeatedly states it would provide a full account of the war between prehistoric Athens and Atlantis, drawn from Egyptian temple records that Solon personally examined. Solon saw maps. Plato promised geography, named islands, coastlines, distances from known landmarks. Details that could be tested today using archaeology and oceanography. All of that disappeared with the missing ending. And the problem goes further. Plato clearly designed the Atlantis story as a trilogy. Timaeus sets the cosmic framework and introduces Atlantis. Critias describes the civilization at its height and its corruption. A third dialogue, Hermocrates, is named and introduced in the text, then vanishes completely. Most scholars believe Hermocrates was meant to conclude the story. Atlantis's final destruction, the fate of survivors who escaped the catastrophe, and most importantly, the precise geography Plato insisted had been preserved in ancient Egyptian records for anyone willing to search. If Plato's ending vanished from papyrus, then the Egyptian source that inspired it may have suffered an even more permanent fate, and whatever knowledge it contained may have been lost long before anyone realized how dangerous it would be to keep. The Pillars of Sais. Nobody ever found Atlantis carved into stone except one man who claimed he did. And then everything that could prove it disappeared. The pillars, the records, even his own writing. What survived was only a second-hand warning that the evidence once stood in plain sight inside an Egyptian temple before history quietly erased it. That man was Crantor. Around 300 BCE, the Greek philosopher traveled to Egypt and went straight to Sais, an ancient city on the western edge of the Nile Delta. This wasn't idle curiosity. Plato had already identified Sais as the origin point of the Atlantis story, claiming his ancestor Solon learned it there from Egyptian priests who insisted their records reached far beyond anything preserved in Greece. Those priests told Solon about a powerful island empire beyond the Pillars of Hercules, an empire that attacked the eastern Mediterranean, including Egypt itself, before being destroyed by earthquakes and floods in a single catastrophic day. They said it wasn't myth, it was history, and it was written down in their temple archives. Crantor decided to verify that claim. Writing roughly a century after Plato, he went to Sais to see the records for himself. According to the only surviving testimony, recorded by the philosopher Proclus in the 5th century CE, Crantor didn't just hear stories or oral traditions. The priests led him directly into the temple and showed him massive stone pillars still standing at that time, carved from top to bottom with hieroglyphic inscriptions describing the Atlantis account in extensive detail. These weren't small memorial stones. Egyptian temple pillars stood 15 to 20 feet tall, carved on all sides, placed in public spaces where thousands of pilgrims and visitors passed through every year. Temples recorded royal victories, military campaigns, tribute, and major historical events. Egyptian history, not foreign myth. So why dedicate temple pillars to a Western island empire? Plato's account supplies the answer. Atlantis, he said, attempted to conquer all who lived within the Pillars of Hercules. Egypt was explicitly included. If Egypt repelled that invasion, commemorating the victory alongside defeats of the Hittites or the Sea Peoples would have been entirely consistent. If Atlantis was carved at Sais, it wasn't secret knowledge, it was public record, displayed openly for anyone literate in hieroglyphs to read. According to Proclus, the inscriptions matched Plato's version closely. Same sequence of events, same geography, same catastrophic ending. After examining the pillars, Crantor concluded Plato had recorded history, not allegory or philosophical fiction. And then the trail goes dark. Crantor's own writings no longer exist. Everything we know about his journey comes through Proclus, writing nearly 800 years later, quoting him second-hand. The temple at Sais was eventually destroyed. Its stones were dismantled and reused. Its inscriptions were lost to fire, flooding, invasion, and time. The site of ancient Sais, now modern Sa el-Hagar, has been partially excavated since the 1990s. Archaeologists have uncovered foundation blocks and inscribed fragments, but large sections remain buried beneath farmland and modern buildings. The temple complex where Crantor claimed to see the pillars has never been fully excavated. Without that excavation, the pillars cannot be definitively ruled out as still buried underground. Skeptics raise reasonable objections. Proclus could have misquoted Crantor. Crantor might have misunderstood the hieroglyphs, reading them through Greek assumptions. The priests could have tailored their presentation to confirm a story Greeks already wanted to believe. None of those possibilities can be dismissed. But one problem remains. Across centuries, Independent figures, Solon, Plato, Crantor, and later commentators preserve the same framework of names, timelines, geographic markers, and events. If Atlantis was pure invention, it was treated with an unusual level of consistency and precision. And if those pillars truly stood at Sais, carved with records older than Greek civilization itself, then one of the strongest confirmations of Atlantis once existed in physical form before vanishing without leaving a single verified copy behind. While those hieroglyphic pillars crumbled into dust, another piece of evidence was said to be waiting somewhere else, not on land, but beneath the sea. Sicily's orichalcum mystery. In 2015, divers pulled glowing bronze-gold bars from a shipwreck off the coast of Sicily, and for a brief moment, it looked like Atlantis had surfaced. The metal matched Plato's description of orichalcum so closely that headlines around the world declared Atlantis metal found. Then the excitement stalled, not because the metal was fake, but because time itself got in the way. For more than 2,000 years, orichalcum existed only as a detail in Plato's Atlantis account, a rare material that glowed red, ranked just below gold in value, and sheathed the walls of temples and palaces across the island empire. Most scholars dismissed it as fiction, a literary flourish meant to make Atlantis feel exotic and technologically superior. Then everything changed near the ancient port of Gela on Sicily's southern coast. Divers surveying the seabed discovered a shipwreck scattered with cargo. The vessel dated to the late 6th century BCE, a high-value merchant ship carrying weapons and trade goods when it sank. Initial recovery efforts brought up 39 unusual metal ingots. Subsequent dives raised the total to 86. These weren't ordinary bronze or copper bars. Under certain light, the metal flashed red, exactly as Plato described. Researchers who handled the ingots reported an unusual warmth and density that didn't match standard brass or bronze alloys they were familiar with. Laboratory analysis revealed the composition, roughly 75 to 80% copper, 15 to 20% zinc, with trace amounts of iron, nickel, and lead. It was an early form of brass. And that was the problem. Ancient Greek metallurgy wasn't believed to have mastered deliberate copper-zinc alloying at that time, certainly not with the consistency seen in these ingots. The bars were transferred to Sicilian archaeological storage facilities and subjected to X-ray fluorescence analysis. The results deepened the mystery. Trace elements, including nickel and lead, appeared in ratios that didn't align with known Mediterranean copper sources from the period. The zinc content alone raised eyebrows. Historians had long believed controlled brass production didn't emerge until Roman times. Yet these ingots dated to the 6th century BCE. In appearance and properties, the match to Plato's orichalcum was unsettlingly precise. Golden bronze color, reddish glow, exceptional durability, clear value as a trade commodity. But chronology refused to cooperate. The shipwreck dated to roughly 600 to 500 BCE. Atlantis, according to Plato, sank centuries earlier, whether 9,000 years before Solon or under revised interpretations placing the catastrophe around 1200 BCE. The ingots were simply too young. They couldn't be Atlantean artifacts. On their own, they proved nothing about Atlantis, but the implications didn't stay contained. The discovery demonstrated that advanced alloy production, international metal trade, and sophisticated metallurgical knowledge existed earlier and more widely than historians had accepted. It reopened a deeper question. If this metal wasn't Atlantean, then what exactly was orichalcum? Some researchers, including Wishaw, pointed west to Tartessos in southern Spain, a wealthy Bronze Age culture facing the Atlantic that vanished suddenly and mysteriously. They argued orichalcum was a special Spanish alloy that fueled Tartessos's legendary wealth before its collapse. Others, including Jürgen Spanuth, rejected metal entirely. He proposed orichalcum was amber, fossilized tree resin abundant in northern Europe, especially around Helgoland. Still more speculative theories pushed the source farther. Pre-Columbian South America, the Chavan culture. Red gold alloys produced centuries before European contact. Brazilian physicist Enrico Matejevich even argued Atlantis itself lay in the Andes, with orichalcum mined in Peru. What makes this so maddening is how close the answer might be. Modern spectroscopy and isotope analysis can trace metal sources with extraordinary precision. Trace elements act like geographic fingerprints. One genuine sample of correctly dated and chemically analyzed Atlantean orichalcum could identify its mine of origin and point to a specific region: Spain, North Africa, Northern Europe, or somewhere else entirely. One verified piece wouldn't just support a legend, it would turn Atlantis into coordinates. What it would mean if we found it. If we prove Atlantis existed and then collapsed, we prove that everything we've built, cities, technology, entire civilizations, can vanish so completely that future archaeologists might argue we never existed at all, which means it's already happened before, and it can happen again. Plato described advanced canal systems, international trade networks, and sophisticated metallurgy that existed thousands of years before we thought they were possible. If he was drawing from real events rather than inventing a cautionary fable, then human progress doesn't climb steadily upward in a straight line. It peaks, collapses, and restarts from scratch, losing centuries or millennia of accumulated knowledge in the process. We've done it before on a smaller scale. The Bronze Age collapse erased writing systems, trade routes, and entire cultures around 1200 BCE. Cities burned, populations scattered across the Mediterranean, and it took centuries to recover even basic technologies that had been commonplace before. If Atlantis fell earlier and on a larger scale, it explains why the collapse was so devastating when it finally reached the eastern Mediterranean. The fleeing survivors weren't just raiders and pirates. They were refugees from a civilization that made the Bronze Age kingdoms look primitive by comparison. The material evidence makes the timeline even more uncomfortable. If orichalcum was real and originated outside accepted ancient mining regions, then early civilizations possessed metallurgical knowledge, navigation capabilities, and trade networks far more extensive than current academic models allow. That reshapes fundamental assumptions about Bronze Age technology, long-distance ocean travel, and cultural contact between regions that weren't supposed to have any connection. It means our timeline is wrong, our assumptions about ancient capabilities are wrong, and entire chapters of human history are missing from the record. History also shows what survives collapse and what doesn't. Written records decay. Digital storage corrupts. Structures crumble. Languages die. Future generations lose the ability to read what survives and argue over whether the ruins represent advanced civilization or primitive settlements. Future archaeologists could debate our own achievements the same way we argue over Atlantis, with only partial evidence and distorted stories to work from, unable to believe we actually built what the ruins suggest. That possibility reframes every vanished clue we've chased. Nothing lasts. Not stone, not words, not even empires built to endure forever. The real question isn't whether Atlantis existed, it's whether we're currently living in someone's future Atlantis, building higher and higher while the evidence of what came before gets blown up, broken, buried, and lost, until all that's left is a story nobody believes. Which of these lost pieces of evidence do you think is still out there waiting to be found? And which of these artifacts may possibly lead us to Atlantis? Let us know in the comments section below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss another deep dive into the mysteries of this world and beyond. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.